Hello, welcome to the inaugural edition of the This is Housing podcast, brought to you by the expert team of solicitors in the housing department at Duncan Lewis. My name is Richard Mahal, and I am a solicitor in the housing department at Duncan Lewis, which is headed up by Manjinder Kaur Atwal, who is with me today for this inaugural episode. The purpose of this podcast is to bring housing law to a wider audience for lay people, so that lay people can understand better their rights and understand their responsibilities. So joining me today is Ovaiz Panwala, a trainee solicitor in the team at Duncan Lewis. Ovaiz, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So I'm a trainee solicitor at Duncan Lewis. I've been here for about 3 years now, and I work in a variety of different areas in housing. That includes homelessness, disrepair, judicial reviews, amongst many other things. Yes, thank you, Richard.
I've also got Daljit Singh Shina joining us today. Daljit, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Daljit. I am one of the solicitors at Duncan Lewis. I'm actually Ovaiz supervisor, who's sitting next to me, so that should be interesting to see what he's got to say today. And yeah, I'm part of Manjinder's team, who's also here, who's a guest speaker. Deal with the same sort of work as Ovaiz does: housing, homelessness, possession, disrepair. We're here to help as many people as we can.
Thanks, Daljit. Rita, another trainee solicitor, is here for today's episode. Rita, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. Thank you. Hello, I'm Retha Khan. I'm a trainee solicitor in the housing department, led by Manjinder. I do pretty much the same work as the rest. I have experience in homelessness matters, including statutory reviews and appeals, housing condition claims, injunctions, judicial review challenges, and defending possession proceedings. I also enjoyed dealing with discrimination matters with a focus on the Equality Act 2010 claims, as well as Care Act 2014.
Thanks, Rita. And last but not least, we have Manjinder Kaur Atwal, the head honcho. Manjinder, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you came to be at Duncan Lewis?
Oh, hello. My name is Manjinder Kaur Atwal. I'm the director. Thank you, Richard, for the lovely introduction. I have been a solicitor since, funny enough, April Fool's Day on 2011. So I've been practicing in housing and litigation for 12 years, but been working in the area of law for over 15 years. I kind of fell into housing, to be honest. It was when I first started as a paralegal, I actually specialised in criminal law. Mm-hmm. So I did that for a year. And subsequently, I was doing civil litigation work. And my passion was in housing law and dealing with possession claims, disrepair, unlawful evictions, homelessness was an area of law that I had great interest in, and I knew the work that we do could make a huge difference to people in the country. So yes, and until this day, I'm still very passionate about what I do and what we do as a firm.
I might open this question up to the rest of our guests, but the purpose of today's episode is to really discuss broadly why housing law is in our view, such an important topic that normal people should be interested in or care about. Why do we think, Ovaiz, that housing is such an important area of practice?
I mean, to begin with, it's everybody has a home, right? It's such an important, integral part of everyone's day-to-day life to have somewhere to sleep safely, having a roof over their heads. And unfortunately, what we find is that, especially between landlords and tenants, a lot of people don't know their actual rights that they can apply in terms of enforcing repair works to be done, or if in the worst case scenario, if somebody is threatened with homelessness, who can they go to? Is there anybody that they can reach out and get that support from their local authority or anybody else? And so just based on those principles alone, it's quite an important piece of information that everybody should be aware of. So know your rights.
I think people definitely underestimate the importance of housing law. It doesn't sound like the kind of area of practice that people associate with a typical city firm of solicitors. But I think it's fair to say, Rita, do you agree that housing law is becoming a more and more important area of practice because of the housing crisis?
Yes, absolutely. I think even prior to the housing crisis, there's been an ongoing issue. It's a concern as to what Ovaiz said, where people do not actually understand what their rights are. I think in relation to the government cuts on funding, it's limited a lot of people, and it's just caused a bit of a concern. In light of the situation with the cost of living, I think it's absolutely fundamental that people are aware of just how significant housing in itself is. Whilst it sounds broad, it is very much significant, and actually it's quite a very complex area of law, and people really don't realise that.
And what are the kinds of different legal principles that housing law involve in terms of practice on a day-to-day basis? Daljit, someone who is a solicitor of several years post-qualification experience, what kind of legal principles do you end up dealing with on a day-to-day basis? What is housing law? Is in effect what I'm asking.
That's a big topic.
Yeah.
It's a big topic in the sense that it's not sexy. It's not one of those sort of things that, like you said, it's not typical city, central London sort of work. But as Ovaiz and Rita correctly said, it affects literally everyone. And it's a bit even wider than that. We're like, a lot of the discussion that we might have might be focused on the tenants' rights, but similarly, you've got to look at it from both sides of the fence. There's also a landlord involved in. So we're here to help as many people as we can, both landlords and tenants. And we're also here to help people who actually might not have a home or a habitable home, and that could be massive. So you're looking at anything from homelessness where you haven't got a home. So you might want to challenge a local authority on how to bring a claim, any hurdles you might face whilst trying to make an application. And thereafter, once you get into a home, there are different hurdles in that as well. So, is your home habitable? Can you live there? Should you be living there? Should some works be done to it? As a landlord, what are you doing to ensure you comply with your part of your tenancy obligations? And then from that, it builds even further into, well, if I need my house back, or if my landlord is seeking the house back, or the property back, what rights do I have? Like, what do I need to do? What steps should I take? So it's such a wide range of work, effectively, in such a massive area of law. It's so easy to get mixed up. And it's so easy to get lost in it. Like you said, know your rights, but there's so many aspects of one area of housing law. Where do you start? And that can be the confusing part.
I think the relevant legal frameworks that apply in the field of housing law generally can range from contract law to public law. Housing is a regulated area, so there's plenty of legislation, primary and secondary legislation, and all of that feeds into the practice of housing law. But it makes it, as a result, it's really a hybrid area of practice in a sense. You have to be a good generalist, I think, in order to understand, in order to be a good housing solicitor. Manjinder, can we talk a little bit about the issue of funding for housing law kinds of challenges? What funding is there out there to assist tenants perhaps who are in a difficult situation, who have a difficulty with their landlord, they might be at risk of eviction, they might have received some notice asking them to leave, or they might have issues with the condition of the property. How can people in those kinds of situations enforce their rights, and what funding regimes are in place?
I think a lot of people misunderstand legal aid. Legal aid is available for those who are eligible for possession claims for disrepair matters, for unlawful evictions. And I guess the problem is the lack of legal aid contracts and the lack of firms and lawyers dealing with legal aid in housing. And I think that's the biggest issues that we are probably encountering at the moment is the legal aid rates are not great. So for some firms, it doesn't make commercial sense on taking on legal aid work. But also there is CFAs, no window fee agreements, as they're known as, available for housing law and the obvious private paying clients. But as we previously said earlier, the cost of living has impacted a lot of people who are probably unable to pay legal fees because they can be very costly, especially if you lose. But legal aid is something that I believe a lot of changes need to be made. I don't know if you all agree. The hourly rates are not great. I don't think they've changed for many, many years. And a lot of firms are not taking on this work.
So Manjinder, I was specifically, if a tenant has a problem with, for instance, their boiler, it's broken, and they ask their landlord to fix it, and the landlord refuses, what can they do to enforce their rights? Is everyone eligible to receive legal aid? Is it only some people? Is there means testing that applies for legal aid?
Not everybody is going to be eligible for legal aid. There is a criteria that needs to be satisfied with the legal aid agency. So those who are on benefits or low income possibly could be eligible for legal aid, but that's something what we do at Duncan Lewis, we carry out the assessment and make a determination whether the client is or is not eligible for legal aid. But it doesn't end there. There are other different funding arrangements that can be put in place in order to assist a client. But we also, if them funding arrangements are not going to work, then we do signpost them or we do try to assist. And what we do a lot of is pro bono work to assist these tenants or guide them on what they can and can't do. I think that's the difference, because we do have the benefit of a legal aid contract. We are able to take on cases, clients who unfortunately are not able to access legal advice elsewhere, which is why we have clients from everywhere, from Bristol, Dorset to London, because of the lack of legal aid contracts.
So you talk about the lack of legal aid contracts. In that, it's not the case, therefore, that if you're a tenant, you can just turn up to any solicitor's firm and say, I've got a problem with my landlord, I want to enforce my rights, but I'm on a low income, can you give me legal aid and take my case on effectively with the benefit of legal aid, and I don't have to pay anything? You have to approach a firm of solicitors that has a legal aid contract.
Correct.
Right?
Yes. So, and not many firms have that contract. So yeah, it's a difficult time, but we are doing as much as we can do.
There's certainly been a surge in the number of client inquiries that we've been taking, I think, at Duncan Lewis over the past couple of years. There is a dearth of legal aid solicitors who can provide advice and expert representation in the field of housing law generally. But I think that as the demand for this service has increased over the last couple of years with the acceleration of the housing crisis, there are fewer and fewer basically solicitors with capacity to take on new client matters. But we do our best at Duncan Lewis.
Yeah, but we are seeing a surge and concerning number of possession cases. I think in the last 12 months. Do you agree?
There's been an increase in the number of possession cases.
This could be as a result of the cost of living, people losing their jobs since COVID. That had a major impact on our area of law. Some areas of law kind of stopped working. But I thought during that period was probably the most busiest time. I saw a lot of unlawful evictions cases during COVID because the whole possession cases possession claims were stopped.
I think definitely it's the case that the housing law is, as an area of practice, affected massively by what is going on in the wider economy. And so if there are regulatory governmental changes that will have an impact upon the private rented sector, that will therefore have an impact on tenants. There's obviously, as we saw with COVID, recessions happening in the economy. It obviously impacts the whole gamut, the whole range of housing law practice. So at the moment, I think that perhaps, and I'll invite anyone else to comment on this, I think there are probably 2 to 3 factors that are really driving the surge in demand for housing law advice and representation at the moment. The first is obviously, as Manjinder said, COVID. 2, there's been a slowdown in the economy. And 3, there are proposed changes by the government to things like Section 21, the Section 21 possession process, which is really the no-fault eviction process by which a landlord can regain possession of their home. There are proposals by the government to actually outlaw Section 21, and that's certainly, I think, having probably an impact on private landlords who are thinking whether or not they want to exit the market at this stage. What do you think, Rita?
Yeah, definitely.
Anything else?
I do agree with that. That's something we will be touching base on in future podcast episodes. So it would be good to stay tuned to in relation to that and see what we've got to say and discuss.
Daljit, are there any other things that you think are driving the increase in demand for housing law advice and representation at the moment, beyond the 3 things that I've outlined?
I think you hit it probably a bit more squarely when you said we are affected by everything that happens in the wider sort of political scale. Because from a tenant perspective, yes, unlawful evictions massively went up during COVID purely because landlords couldn't get their houses back or their properties back. Thereafter, during the same period of time, a lot of works couldn't be done to houses, so they also fell into a state of disrepair, which you see a lot more tenants having issues with, and landlords taking a bit of a back step. On top of that, you've got the whole interest rate increase and the effect it's having on mortgages. So the landlords themselves kind of think, well, it's not really viable for me to continue. So I need people out of the property in order for me to sell it or to do what I want with it, or live in it or do anything else. But it's not something that they can afford to keep. So it all kind of affect the home. So it doesn't matter, be it your home where you're staying or your rented home where you're giving out to others. Everything around the landscape kind of affects it. And it could be something as small as a bad winter. If you have a bad winter and you have a bit of disrepair in the property, that can massively exacerbate things going on in the house when you're home. And so that will have a spike in potential claims against landlords for not being able to keep their property in good condition. By the same token, if you've had a bad winter and something happens to the structure of the building, the landlords need to take steps in order to comply with their obligations. But again, in the current climate, can they afford to do so? Is that having an impact on more and more claims for possession being bought, and then counterclaims for disrepair or being bought in response? Because it's a massive circle and it affects everything from top to bottom. And we are kind of at the mercy of what's going on in the political landscape around us. Like you said, the Section 21s, landlords are thinking, well, if everything is costing me more and I need to get rid of my property, I need to get them as soon as possible, because if not, then no fault evictions are not going to be existing anymore. How do I actually get a tenant who's otherwise been great out of the house?
And the private rental sector is now so massive, particularly in London, particularly for young people. Now, people can't afford to buy homes, so they're dependent upon the private rental sector. And there is a balance between supply and demand. The government is always being lobbied to try to not do things that might end up reducing the supply of private rental sector properties. But then this is opposite reaction from tenants and the tenants lobby, seeking greater regulation over the private rental sector, because I think at the moment it's fair to say that the private rental sector, there isn't so much regulation. There hasn't been so much regulation until more recently with the introduction of the Fitness for Human Habitation Act. I think something we are now seeing coming down the road is, which will be quite interesting, as the requirement that the private rental sector properties actually meet a certain minimum energy efficiency standard. So that is going to require a lot of landlords to think about whether or not they actually want to retrofit insulation in their homes in order to bring them up to that minimum standard, and that's going to have a huge impact probably on the supply as well, I think.
And definitely, and it's more so than that. It's tenants deserve
Yes.
a good, good home to live in.
Yes.
So should regulation be of private landlords just as it is with social landlords or local authorities? Well, why not? Yes, it's onerous on the landlord, but it still affects your home. So there should be more regulation. And again, then you've got the two lobbies saying, well, how much is too much regulation and what is the minimum that we need? It's a really interesting area.
Yes.
It's definitely a topic of conversation in the next episodes, because I think we can really
dive into it in a little bit more detail. Okay, well, that's certainly very interesting, and I think we've canvassed a number of topics there, which we're going to go into a lot of detail on later episodes. So I think for today, this was a whistle-stop tour of the kinds of issues and topics that we're going to be discussing on this podcast going forward. The purpose of which is to really help our audience understand their rights and their responsibilities when it comes to housing. So I hope that you'll join us on the next episode, in which we'll be diving into the topic of disrepair, the big topic of disrepair. So I hope you'll join us for the next episode of the This Is Housing podcast, which Manjinder, Ovaiz, Daljit and Retha will be joining me to discuss the big topic of disrepair. Thank you for joining us on this episode, the inaugural episode. Bye-bye.